let's take a look at another way of solving the palindrome problem. Now remember, there's no one way of solving all these problems. So if you came up with a solution that is different from my own, totally fine. For this alternative solution, we are not going to manually reverse any string at all. Instead, for this solution, we're going to make use of another array helper, just like the reduce helper that we used just a moment ago. So let's take a look at some documentation. In this solution, we're going to make use of the every array helper. So we'll take our string, we'll turn it into an array, and then we will use this every helper on it. Now I'm at the MDN documentation for every, and if you want, you can come here yourself and take a look at some of the documentation, but I'll give you a quick description of how every works right now. The every function is used to do a Boolean check on every element within an array. So for example, if we had an array containing the values 0, 10, and 14, and we wanted to ask the question if every single value in there was greater than 5, we could write some code that looks like this right here. We would take the array, we'd call the every function on it, and then we would pass in a function to invoke for every element within the array. So the first time that this function was executed, we would pass in the first element as val. We would check to see if 0 was greater than 5. In this case, 0 is not greater than 5, so we would return false from this statement right here. When the every function runs, it checks to see the return value of every function run. If every function, or if any function I should say, if any function returns false, then the overall expression will return false as well. However, if the inner function comparison right here returns true for every element, then the entire function expression will return true. So every is very aptly named. It's essentially executing a check or some type of comparison for every element within the array. So I bet you might be able to have some idea of how we can use this to check to see if we are working in a palindrome. Here's what we're going to do. Let's imagine this is the array of characters that we're working with. We're going to take the first element of the array, which is A, and we'll compare it with the element at the very end. If the two are equal, then we will return true and say, okay, looks good, so far this is a palindrome. Then for the next element, we'll take it and compare it to the second to last value. We'll compare the two and say, are they the same? Okay. And then we will repeat the process throughout the array. So for C, we will essentially compare C to itself because it's at the very center. We'll then compare B to the previous B, and then we'll compare the last element to the first one. Now, one thing that you might immediately lock on here is to notice that we are doing more comparisons that are necessary, and that is absolutely true. Once we have checked every element up to the very center right here, we don't really have to check all the remaining elements because we already checked to see if A, or the first element, was equal to the last one. So we technically don't have to iterate through the rest of the array and compare them back to the first elements inside of here. And so I'm going to say that this is not an ideal solution for this problem, just because we are doing essentially twice as much work as we really have to do. However, there is a reason I am showing you this solution. And I'm showing this solution just so you can explain to your interviewer what I just explained to you. When you are working with an interviewer and answering their questions, in many cases, they'll say to you, hey, I think that your problem or your solution has a problem. Here's what it is. What are you going to do about it? And so many times you need to be able to respond, identify, and somehow solve these issues that come up with your own solutions. The issue here of double comparison, so comparing the first to the last, and again, the last to the first, is a really easy thing to bring up in an interview. And it's a really easy way to look good to your interviewer. You can propose this solution with the every helper and then say, you know what, I think this is a clear solution. However, it's comparing, or it's doing about twice as much as it needs to do. And so maybe you could then suggest some alternative solution. So when you are in an interview setting, remember, you don't have to beeline the best solution right away. If you can think of multiple solutions to a problem, I highly recommend you give multiple solutions. It just shows your interviewer that you are aware of multiple ways of solving a problem, and it also makes them aware that you can compare and contrast between different ways of solving a problem. So as I've said many times so far, and I will say several times again throughout the course, many ways to solve a problem, and it's really in your interest to be aware of all the different ways of doing it. Okay, so with that in mind, let's put this to the test. So back inside my index.js file, I'm going to make a backup of our initial solution. And then I will delete the function body here, and we'll put together a solution with the every function. So the first thing we have to do is turn our string into an array. Remember, strings do not have access to that every helper, it's only arrays. So we'll call string.split, pass in the empty string, and then call every. Now the first element, or first argument to every function, is a function that will be called for every element in the array. We will receive the first argument to this function, which is each character from the array, as an argument that we will call char, or short for character. And then the other thing to keep in mind here is that because we want to compare each element to its essentially mirror on the other side, we also need to figure out some way of getting access to the element on the other side of the array. So fortunately, as a second argument to this function right here, we are given the index of the element that we are currently iterating over, which we will record as I. So the first time this inner function is called, I will be equal to 0 because we are operating on the first element in the array. So now inside of here, inside the function, we can return a comparison between the current element and the mirrored element on the other side of the array. Now getting access to the other side is a little bit complicated, but it's really not that bad. So the first time we run our function, we are at index 0 right here. So I would be equal to 0. To get access to the element on the opposite side, we could look at the entire string array and access the element at the length of the array minus 1. So remember, all arrays in JavaScript are 0 indexed. So right here we would start off as 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. So over here would be 4. There are 5 elements in the array, so we can't say look at the element at array.length. We have to say look at the element at array.length minus 1 to give us 4. So in other words, long story short, all we really have to do here is look at the string at string.length minus I. So that will make sure we increment for every step through the loop or through the every function minus 1. And the minus 1 right here is to make sure that we are taking into account the fact that length is the overall length, but we are 0 indexed with JavaScript arrays. Cool, so this is looking good. Now the last thing we have to do, and this is a real gotcha, never forget it, we need to make sure we return the result of the every function call. So I will put my return statement in here. I also forgot to comment out the palindrome function down here. I'll make sure I do that. And I think we're ready to test this. So I'm going to save the file. We'll check our terminal, and it looks like all of our tests are still passing. Great. So again, this is not an ideal solution right here, but it definitely gives you a little bit of, ammunition to work with your interviewer. It gives you something to talk about and say, here's a solution. It makes use of an advanced array helper, which shows that you know what you're talking about, but it's also not the best way of solving it, which gives you something to talk about, and you can then propose this other solution down here. Cool. So this has been a pretty good solution. Let's continue the next section and look at our next problem.